one. All orchid species that are pollinated solely by insects have features that attract insects. All right, so we just learned something. This is actually a sufficient condition. Let's read carefully. So all orchids that are only pollinated by insects, so those are their only pollinators, the insects, right? They have features that attract those insects. So if I have an orchid species that's only pollinated by insects, I know it has to have features that attract insects. No matter what, has to have that. This is our sufficient condition. If you're an orchid species that's pollinated solely by insects, you have features that attract insects. And it kind of makes sense, right? If you're solely pollinated by insects, you'd probably need something to get in there in the first place, right? So the flower of a recently discovered orchid species, now we've got a new orchid, its flower contains edible tendrils that invariably attract insects to the inside of the flower. Yay! This one attracts insects. Now, before I read any further, I'm going to ask myself how those two sentences that I just read are related. I know that if you're an orchid species that is solely pollinated by insects, you have features that attract insects. And oh, this flower has features that attract insects. Do I know for sure that this one is pollinated solely by insects? No, because I don't know that that feature is enough to guarantee that it is solely pollinated by insects, right? If you're a flower that's solely pollinated by insects, you have features that attract them. But are those the only type of flowers that have features that attract insects? Not as far as I know. Right? This is like if I said all bike riders carry water bottles with them. And then if I said, oh my gosh, Andrew carries his water bottle with him, he must be a bike rider. No, there could be plenty of other people that carry water bottles that aren't bike riders, right? So just because these orchid species have features that attract insects doesn't mean they're the only species that have features that attract insects. So I know this orchid species does have a feature that attracts insects. It may or may not be included in this orchid species that is pollinated solely by insects. All right, hence it follows that this orchid species is one that is pollinated solely by insects. You guys, we can predict the bad conclusions. It's so easy to do. We should be protecting ourselves against these bad conclusions. When we see a sufficient condition, we should be really fleshing it out, seeing what it means and how it relates to the rest of the passage. So what we know is, sure, this flower might be one that's solely pollinated by insects, but also it might not be, right? Andrew might be a bike rider because he carries a water bottle, but also he might not be, right? So let's go ahead and go into the question. It says the argument is flawed because it assumes that this flower having a feature that attracts insects necessarily guarantees that it's one that's pollinated solely by insects. And I just don't think that's true. All right, A makes an unwarranted assumption that a characteristic that is shared by two classes of things is their only common feature. This is way different than what we're going for, right? The author never says, oh, that's the only common feature between these orchid species. Definitely not. Because as far as I know, the author is thinking they share two features. They're pollinated solely by insects, and they have features that attract insects. So I can get rid of it for that reason alone, right? They don't have only one common feature. The other thing, too, is the author's not trying to say there are two classes of things. The author's trying to say they're the same class. The author's trying to convince us that they're pollinated solely by insects. That's the one class that they belong to. So this one is way off base for so many reasons. B assumes without warrant that a characteristic that distinguishes one class of things from another is the only characteristic that distinguishes that class from the other. So be careful. We're not talking about two different classes here. We're only talking about the same class of things, right? This author's trying to say they both are orchid species that are pollinated solely by insects. The author never talks about any other class of orchids. And so this would be like if the author said, hey, this orchid species that's pollinated solely by insects, they have features that attract insects. And so, and the author would then say, and so this is the only thing that makes them different from any other orchid species. And that's not what the author did, right? The author wasn't distinguishing different orchid species. The author was trying to make them similar, right? The author wasn't saying this newly discovered orchid species is different. He wasn't distinguishing it in any way. He was trying to tell us that it's the same as these other orchid species that are pollinated solely by insects. So because this one says distinguishes, I'm getting rid of it. C, mistakes a characteristic that is unique to one particular class of things for a characteristic that is unique to an unrelated class of things. No, right? He doesn't say, oh my gosh, all these orchid species are pollinated solely by insects, and these are the only ones that are pollinated solely by insects. That's just not at all what he's doing. Answer choice C doesn't happen in the argument. D, treats a characteristic known to be true of one class of things as if that characteristic were unique to that class. Yes. So C and D look similar on the surface, but they're not, right? Because instead what D is talking about is that characteristic that is known to be true of one class of things. So let's use the words from the passage here, right? The author treats the characteristic of having features that attract insects, which is true of all orchid species that are pollinated solely by insects, as if having features that attract insects is unique to only orchid species that are pollinated solely by insects. That's our big flaw here, right? The author's assuming that the only orchid species that have features that attract insects are the ones that are pollinated solely by insects. That's how this author gets to the conclusion of, oh, this flower has features that attract insects, must be pollinated solely by insects. That's an issue, right? So D is definitely what's going on. C, on the other hand, it says it mistakes this characteristic that's unique for a characteristic that is unique to an unrelated class of things, right? The author isn't trying to combine unrelated classes, right? These are both orchids here. So this one's got to go, and D, again, is our answer choice. E, makes broad generalizations about all members of a particular class of things. Does he talk about all members of a particular class of things? No. He's talking about all orchid species that are pollinated solely by insects. That's one class. But he doesn't talk about all orchid species that ever existed, right? So he's not making broad generalizations there. And then it's not on the basis of what is known about a member of an unrelated class of things. Nothing here was unrelated, right? This one's got to go. There weren't broad generalizations. Nothing was unrelated. This one's out. And D has to be our answer choice. Don't be afraid to use that tactic that we kind of just went over of using the words from the passage in the answer choice. It helps a lot in getting through this kind of abstract wording. It's like, I don't understand any of these. But if I replace it with the words from the passage, it makes a lot more sense. Don't be afraid to do that. Okay, any questions here, you guys? Let me just parse through the chat real quick. Otherwise, it looks like you're good to go. Okay, then I am going to go ahead and end class. I hope you guys have a really great rest.